Our next speaker for the evening will be Mr. Eric Sanzik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, as usual, want to thank Administrator Rogers getting me the proposed budget in a very workable format. That was really nice, and also answering my usual round of preliminary questions, which are always lengthy. So I appreciate your time on that very much. Also, the work session with you guys on the budget had a lot of really good questions on expenses, questions on big ticket items, outside services, even the office phones. That was very encouraging. It was by far the most involved and in-depth discussion I've heard on expenses for our county, and so I wanted to thank you all on all that for that work session. If we go to slide 2, so first, showing our expenditures from FY22 spend to this proposed FY26 budget. The bottom section, something I wanted to focus on is we have percentage increases since FY22 for each department in that general fund. I thought something that kind of caught my eye here was that rec and culture had a 48% increase in expenditures over that time period, just given the recent conversations. It's still a small number overall, but I just thought that was interesting given the recent conversations that over this 5-year view that it was 48%. But in general, the general fund increased in total $14 million, 19% over those 5 years. Slide 3 has employee FTEs and compensation. The middle section, compensation spend per department. All that I did to get these numbers was to identify the compensation detail line in the budget, and then I just added a tag to do a sum on it. So I'm basically just pulling out the compensation lines and then just aggregating it up. I didn't do anything fancy or manipulate. I just pulled the lines and added them up into different departments. So over these 5 years, we have total compensation expenditures increasing from 18 million in FY22 to 26 million in FY26, 39% increase in 5 years. Slide 4 tracks our year-over-year compensation increases per department. It's important to know that this view is cumulative. So looking at that bottom line, we added 8% to all compensation in FY23, and then the next year we added 10% on top of that, and then 9%, then 7% on top of that. So that bottom line, the total aggregate increases will be moved to the next slide. Slide 5 brings us to our aggregate increases in those gray shaded cells. And with that, you can then compare our year-over-year increases, our compensation year-over-year increases to the indexes of Virginia state employee increases, inflation, and Social Security COLA. So for example, that top section, you have Campbell County employees getting an increase of 8% in 22, while Virginia state employees received a 5% increase. If you apply that 3% difference to our compensation spend, it amounts to $600,000 more spend for that year. And then you have $750,000 in the next year, $1.5 million in the next year, and then $1 million in the next year. That middle section, we tracked right on it with inflation in 22. In 23, we spent 1.4 million more, then 1.5 million and 1 million more. And Social Security is pretty much the same thing as inflation there. So a good question is, what would it look like if we actually did adjust our compensation spend and our proposed budget to these indexes, to an average of these indexes? And that is the next slide, slide 6. So the blue line shows our compensation spend, what it would have looked like if we were tracking to Virginia state employees, inflation, or Social Security COLA. It's got a couple more lines here. So yeah, if we were tracking, that was that blue line there. So total compensation spend in this FY26 budget would be around $22 million. Instead, we're at 25.6 million. So over the last 5 years, if we had been tracking to those indexes, we would have spent $8 million less in total for compensation. So I had not seen this type of analysis in any of the budget documents so far and thought you all might be interested to take a view. So thank you for giving us time to comment.
Thank you, Mr. Sanzik. Yeah, absolutely.
That's when you added the line.
Yeah, so just by way of example, now like Mr. Harvey and Mr. Tweedy and administration, right? So there's changes under the, and then forward again. Let's go back. Sorry, I don't mean back again. Yeah. Okay, so public safety, health and welfare, the red there, right? I'm assuming that's sort of an alert. Remember, over the same period of time, we've added deputies, we've added public safety crews, we've made compensation adjustments to mitigate turnover, and then in health and welfare, you've got DSS adding about 10 employees over time. So don't know exactly, Mr. Sanzik got spreadsheets from me, sort of haven't seen the detail behind his work, but just always want to remind the board and make sure folks don't say 39% in admin. Right, there's always another layer of explanation behind those numbers. When we go through the budget, we do tie our baseline across the board raise to the state raise. As we've talked about in each of our budget cycles over the past several years, that's the base raise. There are career ladders, there are promotions, there are folks that leave and we have to bring in replacements and more. There are adjustments over the course of the year, but that's the base level. So I always appreciate Mr. Sandvik dialed in. We have great support, really good questions, but just I didn't want this to leave the room and have somebody sort of misunderstanding. Thanks.
Frank, question to you. Can you move forward or backwards, whichever? You keep going, keep going. Okay, the next one. Okay, top left number there under 2022, 8%. Okay. And I think what he's doing is comparing it to the 5% that the state employees got, which is a percentage. Is that 8% reflective of a wage increase percentage, or is it the compensation growth in that category?
Question. I'm not exactly sure. Across the board, county, they 5% compensation pulled together. The people that actual, right, you would have seen an 8%.
Right. So that doesn't take into account the additional resources, headcount, FTEs, because that's an 8% growth on the spending line, or the that.
Question, I want to highlight that there are other parts to some of those figures.
Question to you, Eric. Where did you get your 8%?
I will admit, when I get these kind of financial breakdowns from someone else, that I am using their data and I usually send it back. And I sent back to Administrator Rogers my initial compilation, which is essentially lining up every budget that we've had, all the spend that we've had year over year. And it still would take some digging to go through my version because it is very different from what I received from the county. That being said, yeah, so on that number specifically, what I look at is if it says comp space dash space, it's basically saying this is what was paid out in compensation for this department or within this team. And I'm not doing anything other than identifying any line that says compensation. And I'm just basically pulling that out and saying, what's that total aggregate number? That top left 2022 that you're looking at there, that's basically saying from the prior year, we spent a certain amount of dollars. If you roll it back, you could actually see the actual dollar amounts that was spent there. And then the next year, the total aggregate that was spent out in compensation, the lines that are tag compensation, it's an 8% increase.
Yeah, so that's he's using the word aggregate multiple times there. So I'm not sure your schedule is, at least it appears to me, when you're saying the Virginia State employees went up 5% on wage increases, is entirely different from the aggregate change in spending for compensation. Does that make sense?
Right. So their state employees, yeah, for that year, they essentially all got a 5% increase. And then if you look at the change in our spend that it also occurred on that year, that's the comparison, is to say, how does our spend compared with what's happening at the state level?
Yeah, and that assumes that all the head counts are the same. So if you've had an increase in head count, that's going to drive the aggregate spending, which might not be reflective of what somebody got as a wage increase. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Headcount will absolutely affect the aggregate total dollar amounts, but an organization that has 10 FTEs and increases their wages by 5% and an organization that has 150 employees, if they're still increasing their compensation spend by a certain percentage, it's the percentage that we're interested in and how much that is changing year over year. And that is a comparable metric in terms of what the spend was for that year and what the state was doing at that comparable time as well.
So I think what you're saying then, that the state's compensation for the entire state only went up 5% in spending.
Yeah, you can see the reason why you can see that it is comparable is that, so if you look at 22, for what our compensation increases was 8%, and then Virginia State employees 5%. In the next year, we both go up. And then we both come down. Only we come down only a little bit, and then they come down. And then it comes down even more next year. So it's tracking the same years, it's tracking the same timeframes, and it's just comparing what percent increase was the state doing, or what was inflation, or what was Social Security COLA, and comparing it, what was our compensation increases year over year.
it was how our compensation changed.
The spend changed for that year.
Right,
the
in
same
aggregate.
time period.
Yeah,
Right.
in
If you did back up a
Tracking
few
it.
slides, you could see the aggregate dollar amounts, right?
My understanding of the difference here is we budget a 5% and again, did you back out part-time in the comp analysis, Eric? But asides, right? We budget a 5% and based on this analysis that we'll accept for the argument, at the end of the day, it was actually 8. The state budgeted 5% and we're assuming end of the year it was 5%. But we don't know that, right? Because we didn't get into the actual spend of the state. We just went to what the state authorized year over year. Is that correct?
Yep.
So perhaps the state budgeted 5 and ended up at 8 as well on the actual. But to remind the board, our across the board raises track to the state across the board raise. And then the activity over the course of the year, again, not owning the 8 with a great deal of respect for Eric and his effort, is usually a movement around that number.
So our 8 was really 5, is what you're saying.
For that analysis, both the state gave an across the board 5 and we gave an across the board 5. To compare our 8, we would have to know,
What they
we'd
did.
want to validate the 8 and then we'd want to say beginning year, end of year state, what did your comp change? Is it 8% or did it hold to 5?
Yeah, where some clarity might be brought in there is if you look at the budget, what was budget FY25 and FY26, which is not shown here. I think you'd have to go back. Can you go back some slides there? Right there. So if you look at what was in budget FY25, what was budget FY26, that's just comparing budget to budget. So if you wanted to get out of the whole, whether it was spend actuals or whether it was just budgeted hypotheticals, going from FY25 to 26 at 7%. And that is above what the state is saying that they're going to do. So even if you wanted to compare budget to budget and what the budget's saying at the state and what the budget we're saying, we're still well above what the state says that they're going to do. So that's taking that spend element out of it if you would be more comfortable with that type of comparison.
So go to the slide where you had your graph.
The very last one, yeah.
So the delta was at 25 million versus 22. I guess it's hard to read from here.
Yeah, 22.
So it looks like we have waste and spending of that gap. Is that what the assertion is?
Waste would be a subjective term. This is just saying if your goal was to track with these indexes, that's what the difference would look like.
I guess I would make one counterpoint to that. That is assuming that we're not trying to catch up for falling behind in pay categories of certain personnel. We know we've certainly had to do that with emergency services, sheriff's department stuff. So simply doing just flat across the board, while good, right? In some part, we are having to pay for previous decisions in years past. So.
And that was the point the point I was trying to make. There's a lot of movement around these numbers. And just one more point of clarity. Did I go back one slide? I'm sorry, another one. Where's the 39? Is that just compensation expenditure increases or is that all?
That's just pulling out the compensation lines.
Yeah, okay.
I will say this, I would love it if this was not correct.
Because what it looks like.
But I'm not doing anything fancy here. I'm just pulling out the compensation.
I mean, it's just, I get into the budget stuff. What it looks like to me is when we move Cliff and Paul into admin, and then in general government, when you budget, that you have a lump sum for the raise. This year it's 1.3 million. When you go to actuals, it's been spread around the departments. So the budget's going to be different from actual and significantly more. Community development, I would have thought that was a year where we paid out a number of incentives, for example. And then transfer sites, I assume that's transfers out, Eric? Because it looks like our budget categories, or is that just our part-time staff at the transfer
I
sites?
think that is compensation, a detail line.
Where we've done some
Compensation.
hourly wage.
Yeah,
Okay.
hourly. So-
Yeah, we upped our part-time staffing there, so.
Yeah, so
Sorry,
I
need to shut up.
it is a good line of questioning in terms of what was spent to actuals, and this state could be off. But if you wanted to take out that equation, which I don't think is entirely necessary, I think it is comparable. But if you want to take that out, still looking at budget to budget, FY25 to 26, yeah, we are putting the one line. I've never seen that in a budget before, where you're just having the one line where you have a lump sum of increases in general admin, which is that huge jump there in 24, 25. But even when you consider that it is still there for going 25, 26, that's that 14% is that lump sum that is there. Even that being said, you still have budget to budget 25 to 26, 6% increase public safety, 9% health and welfare. You still have increases across the board down departments. It's not to say it's not needed. It's just saying that's what it's there. That's what the budget's saying is there.
I'll say, if I may, just to the point, I think what this is just showing, would it be, easy enough for staff to provide just out of those percentages, pick the top 6 and say, yes, this is exactly where this came from. this is the reason that cost was incurred. We added staff, we did extra raises, just something to speak to that.
Sure. I wouldn't replicate Mr. Sanzik's analysis, but we would run our own comp actuals. You guys know you get the actual pay of every employee each year as part of the budget, so you have kind of a snapshot look there. And then we can go back and add in the additional staff, 6 from public safety, a couple in maintenance, a couple in the sheriff. So yes, we can do a little bit of staffing analysis and get that for you. Yes, sir.
Yeah. The intent's not to create work, but just as a self-check, be like,
Right.
take the top couple of biggest hitters and go with that. Thank you, Mr. Sanzik.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, that was everybody that I had signed up to speak. So I will open it up now if there is anybody else in the room